Welcome to this introduction to the Higher Education Risk Assessment Tool, part of the Risk Assessment Toolkit offered by the University of California Office of the President, Office of Risk Services. The UCOP Office of Risk Services offers several of these Excel-based workbooks to meet a diverse set of risk assessment needs across the UC system. Each of these tools has been constructed to provide insight from multiple perspectives. For a complete list of the tools available in the toolkit, please refer to the ERM website. This webinar is focused on the Higher Education Risk Assessment Tool. This tool lists common risks related to higher education, which are organized into the following groups: hazard, financial, information technology, human resources, research, contracts and grants, campus life, and facilities and maintenance. This tool will not make decisions for you, but it will help you organize your thinking as you consider your campus's risk profile and the related enterprise risk management implications. The purpose of this tool is not to ensure all risks are rated as adequately controlled, but rather to help departments and campuses as a whole understand these risks as they relate to them and their controls for sufficiency given their environment, resources, and bandwidth. It's important to understand that this tool is designed to help you make better, more risk-aware decisions, but it will not tell you what the right answer is. These tools function to support a methodical thought process that can be consistently applied to thoroughly evaluate various risks, enabling the user to make better informed decisions. Now, the nature of doing a risk assessment is highly subjective and only provides a user's perception of risks and related impacts. This is why it's important to also evaluate correlating data along with the risk assessment whenever possible to validate your assumptions. Inaccurate data or other information not provided by the user will naturally affect any results, decisions, or recommendations. And final decisions should always be made independently by each organization using this tool. All right, well, with that in mind, let's walk you through the Higher Education Risk Assessment Tool and show you how to use it. We'll start here at the introduction by filling in some basic information about who is using the tool, and then we're going to save it with a unique name in a location we can remember for later. Now, one more note before we get started. When you open the file, you may get a warning about macros or security, such as this one up here. Please don't be alarmed by this. It's probably because the file has a macro to allow the data to be exported into a flat, comma-separated value file, also known as a CSV. Essentially, if you're planning on using the data you enter here in UC's Enterprise Risk Management Information System, which is also known as ERM, you'll want to enable the macros. But the tool will still work fully if you decide not to enable the macros. Of course, make sure you're adhering to any IT security policies your organization has. In some cases, your computer security settings may prevent you from enabling the macro altogether. In these cases, if you wish to use the macro, you will need to work with your system administrator to alter your computer's security settings. Okay, so I'm going to enable this content. Click OK, and let's get started by clicking the Get Started button that appears after our instructions here. Now, to start off, we need to set some common parameters so we understand what the different terms mean when we use them in the tool. Let's start with weighting in the top right corner. Depending on our risk appetite and culture, our weightings for risk impact and risk likelihood might change. Now, for instance, some organizations care more about how many incidents occur rather than how severe they are, so they might weight likelihood higher than impact. However, we might weight impact higher if, for instance, our loss history tells us that risk-related incidents are likely to have broad implications for our organization when they are more extreme, even in small numbers. Now for this demonstration, we have a wide variety of risks we're considering, which is the default for this tool. So we're going to leave these defaults for weighting in place as well. And we're going to weight impact and likelihood evenly at 50% each. However, these other definitions may be subject to more change. So let's consider them. Scale matters here when we're talking about risk impact and risk likelihood. Also, your organization's risk appetite and the types of risks we're considering come into play. Now, for instance, something which constitutes only a moderate impact risk for a campus as a whole, so if we're considering this across an entire campus location, a moderate impact for that scale of an organization may actually be operationally disabling if we were to scale this analysis down to an individual department. A loss on the scale of the campus, scaled down to a department, can be actually very high. So there are scales here for risk impact, risk likelihood, and how effective our controls are. We can leave these preset scales as they are, or we can modify them to suit our needs simply by overriding them. Let me demonstrate this here for you. For instance, if we wanted to change the term very low under risk impact to negligible, we could do so here simply by clicking on very low in there and then just simply typing negligible over it. So once we've made this change, drop-down menus in later pages use this set of terms. So any words that we put in here will get used in later analyses in the sheets later on. Okay. Every page of the tool also has navigation buttons on the left-hand side, which you can use to move between steps. Also, before we leave this page, I'm going to change negligible back to very low because we have data in these other sheets ahead of us here. Also, you'll notice that some cells are shaded in gray and others are white. You can see the difference pretty obviously around the weighting boxes here and these other boxes that we have. Now, the gray cells either have formulas or formatting in them which should prevent you from making accidental changes to the tools. Unshaded cells, the ones that show as white here, can be edited as you see fit. Now, once we've decided on the weighting and the scales that we're using, we're going to move on to the risk assessment page by clicking the Assess Risks button. The list of risks was created here in a collaborative process with stakeholders from across the UC system. Now, while it doesn't cover every risk that may impact an institution devoted to higher education, it's a strong starting point. There are also blank spaces at the bottom of this page to list additional risks at your discretion. You can scroll down here. You can see these categories that we saw earlier. And at the bottom, we have other risks listed with blank spaces. So we have this preset list of hazard risks. We have a preset list of financial risks, and for every category that we have. Once we've reviewed these, we want to move over to risk impact and risk likelihood. And for each of them, we'll select a scale from the drop-down menu. These have already been filled in as we've gone along in this demonstration model. However, we can make changes as well. If we feel like the impact of domestic terrorism, in this case, would be very high, we simply click on very high from there. Or we can make it very low if we see fit. I'm going to move this back to very high. It's also worth noting that that change that we made of turning the word very low to negligible in the previous page this is where we would see that sort of change carried forward. The words very low, as they appear right here, would be changed then to negligible. Okay, so let's make this very high. Okay, so as we're describing how our organization is currently managing each risk, we're selecting these scales based upon our current management. So if I feel like our risk impact is very high in spite of all the controls that we have, that's a valid decision for me to make, and I'm going to simply make that selection here, but knowing that it is made with the current controls that we have in place that we're considering. All right. So then I want to move over to management and mitigation, and this is a free text field. Here, I'm going to describe how our organization is currently managing each risk and describe any mitigation plans or efforts that are already in place. Next, I move over to frequency of controls. And here, I'm going to identify how frequently controls for that risk are performed. And my choices here are multiple times daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, semi-annual, annual, or ad hoc. Now, for example, an audit may be performed annually, but access badges that restrict access to certain areas of the campus or a medical center may be used multiple times daily. We also want to assess the effectiveness of the existing controls that we've just described by selecting a scale from the drop-down menu in Control Effectiveness. Again, when we set our scales at the beginning under Customize Scales, this is the actual set of options that shows up here. So once we've made this selection, a risk rating will be calculated and the risk rating field will populate. This risk rating field is actually over here at the end. We have two other steps in between, but once we choose our control effectiveness, once we choose that one, we have all the information that we need in order to calculate our rating. So it does that then. So the risk rating, let's jump over to this real quick. Risk rating will show as one of the following four options. It will show as potentially over-controlled, which would show up as yellow. We have an example of that here under the very first of the financial risk, conflicts of interest and financial transactions in this example. It's potentially over-controlled. And we also have another yellow one that shows up with potentially poorly controlled. In both of these cases, management should review these risks and determine if controls need to be modified and make changes appropriately. And when we see a green one, that means that it is adequately controlled in this risk rating calculation, and that means that no immediate action is required. Now we also have another option here, and that's the red ones, poorly controlled. Now these risks should receive immediate attention. Then, under Dashboards, Monitoring, and Reporting, that's this column, one of the two that we skipped over here, we'll describe how the control activities are being monitored and identify the person in our organization next to that who is accountable for monitoring these controls. So now when we've completed all of these fields, when we've completed all of these steps, we can export the data into a comma-separated value file, remember a CSV, and we can do that. If we scroll over here, click on the Export button right here. Now finally, let's take a look at the chart for this tool. Under Chart of Risks. And I've zoomed in here a little bit so you saw some of the buttons change in their scale, but this is so we can show it in a bit more detail here. So this chart represents your risk assessment based on your selections for risk likelihood, risk impact, and control effectiveness. There is a drop-down menu at the left of the page which allows you to select which information to plot on the chart. Now, for instance, here we have each category of risks showing as the default. We have reporting in this teal ball up here. Financial risks is the large red one. Campus life risks is the orange one, and so on. That's because we have risk types grouped selected here in this drop-down. However, if we wish to change this, we can instead show a specific set of risks. For instance, if we only wanted to see hazard risks, then we could see each of these different types that we have listed here. So we have laboratory safety, the large purple one up here, catastrophic natural event, pandemic, and domestic terrorism. Again, the names can be pretty extensive in these, so the labels may need to be moved around so that you can see what you're working with. Again, in this chart here, higher severity is going to be at the top of the vertical axis, lower severity at the low end of the vertical axis, high frequency at the far right end of the horizontal axis, and low frequency at the lower end of the left-hand side of the horizontal axis. This should map out as a traditional heat map would in a risk control environment where we have risks that we wish to control in different ways would be actually segmented in different quadrants or different areas of this chart. So risks that we would wish to perhaps transfer or otherwise deal with by engineering them out completely from our situation would be in the top right quadrant. Risks that we may want to insure against would be something in our top left quadrant. And then the ones that we would want to manage would be those in the whole range of frequency, but probably lower severity. So that's really the bottom two quadrants, especially the bottom left quadrant. Those are ones that should be pretty easy to manage. So that said, your entries on these here will vary. So let's go back to showing our risks types grouped here. Again, we can move them around like that. So this is how the chart tool works. We've also got our summary page. Really here, after we've entered all of this, the summary itself is simply this page, and you can print this page as well, so that it will show each of these columns as you fill them in. So this concludes our demonstration of the Higher Education Risk Assessment Tool. Please remember that any results of any risk management decision will only be as effective as the accuracy of the data that you're providing as the user. Inaccurate data or other information not provided by the user will naturally affect any results, decisions, or recommendations. Now, like all the others in the Risk Assessment Toolkit, this tool is just a tool. It helps users analyze their controls relative to this predefined list of risks related to higher education, but it doesn't provide answers. Now, if you have questions or comments about this tool, you can direct them to the ERM Help Desk. That's at erm@ucop.edu. Thanks much for listening.
Thank you. Please stand by.